reading, you probably are thinking that you're going to be listening about a stewardship sermon. And that's reasonable, considering that these verses are speaking about bringing our first fruits as an offering to God. But I'm not going to talk about stewardship today, or at least stewardship in how we traditionally think of it. In this morning's reading, there was a part of one sentence that really jumped out at me. A wandering Aramaean was my ancestor. And that caught my attention and my imagination. So this morning's reflection is on stewardship, but it's stewardship of remembering our past. For it is in the past that is the framework of our present. The question that I would like to ask this morning is this: what is it that grounds us in our lives? Or what is the story that defines me, defines you, defines us? This is the work that we're going to be doing after worship as we are mapping our future workshop. In some ways, I have kind of become the keeper of my extended family's history, its memory. While my siblings and cousins were outdoors playing when we were little, I was that odd child that wanted to be at the table where all the adults were listening to all of their stories. And I was lucky enough to have on both sides of my parents' family that recited at the dinner table stories about our family and about the community in which we lived in. And in fact, when you would ask my grandmother Neil, my mom's mother, a closed-ended question that only requires a yes or no answer, or at least a very abbreviated answer, you would always receive 20 minutes of history lesson about someone or some event that occurred in our family. So impacted by this that to this day I struggle to give just a simple yes and no. Ask Paul. He'll tell you right up front. A couple of years ago, after my divorce, or I should say a couple of years after my divorce, I came to realize that my children were not able to learn about their side of my family history, which would normally have occurred at the dinner table, because that's how I was taught to pass on the family stories. And so one summer, at the end of the summer, when I was returning them to their mother from a summer vacation that I would have with them, we paid a visit to the cemetery in Kingman, Kansas, where I was able to use family monuments and headstones to share with them the kind of people that they came from. Then about 19 years ago, I was able to purchase a copy of my family tree, the one that I was showing the children just a few minutes ago, and it follows my mother's father's family. And in addition to those records, there were supplements of diaries that from some of our family members who had settled in the Iowa Territory. Now, my earliest ancestor arrived in this country from Germany in 1768 as an indentured servant, meaning that for 7 years he was enslaved to the family that had paid for his passage to this country. Now, through these records, I discovered that the family would migrate into new territories as those territories would open up. Eventually, they found their way to the Great Plains Territory, settling near what has become Pella, Iowa. There they opened up a pottery factory and were involved in establishing a small college in the area. And there are marvelous stories by one of my ancestors about his early days in the Colorado gold rush. Learning that at one point he had a transportation business that was less than 90 miles from where Paul and I were living in Wyoming while I was serving the church there. That was news to me. I did not realize. I thought I was the first person to live in that state from the family. Then, when the Oklahoma Territory opened, my family, along with hundreds of others, took part in the Oklahoma land rush. What these records tell me is that I am a part of a people who helped break new horizons, not satisfied with just keeping the status quo. They looked for opportunities of expansion. I come from artisans, industrialists, educators, visionaries, and risk takers. Growing up, not all of this information was available to my parents or grandparents. And I was taught growing up that as an individual, I was as good as anybody else. I was also taught growing up that as an individual, there was a but attached to that story, to their story. I was as good as the next person, but I did not deserve the more in life that many families seem to have. You see, we were a very poor family. And in that setting of surviving day to day, our story became skewed to believe scarcity was the norm for most folks. I mean, after all, my grandparents grew up during the Depression, trying to raise a family. There wasn't a lot of money back at that point in time, for sure. My family's story had become a story of scarcity, and I believe that, until I had moved to Seattle, Washington in 1990. And I began to sell real estate while taking a sabbatical from ministry. I remember telling my mother that there was so much money in Seattle to be made that you could almost just pick it up off of the streets. It was at that point when I was selling homes at an unbelievable price in 1990 for $250,000, and the buyers, believe it or not, would be talking about, oh, well, you know, if we just put in another $50,000, we can make this change and that change and have what we're looking for. I could not imagine such a thing. You're spending $250,000 and you want to make changes that's going to cost another $50,000? Wow. You could not believe it. That's when I realized that my story of scarcity was, in fact, not everybody's story. In many respects, the mainline Christian church's story is like my family's story. It has become skewed to think in terms of scarcity. We're shrinking. We don't have resources to be who we once were. Society no longer supports our message. Multiple extracurricular activities no longer honor church Wednesday nights, let alone, and now they're moving into the sacredness of Sunday morning. That seems to be the story by which many churches are telling themselves. We truly have forgotten who we are. So I'm going to help remind you of who we are. We are children of God, who is so extravagant that we were loved long before we were even aware of God. We are a people who were led out of slavery of Egypt and led into the land of milk and honey. Oh, okay, so what does that mean? Well, Egypt is the symbol of enslavement. No matter what it is that holds us back, that is what enslaves us. Whatever keeps us from working towards the extravagance of living that which God has in store for us, that is our enslavement. The truth is, each of us has our own Egypt that either had enslaved us or may still enslave us. The good news is we don't have to be enslaved. God has provided a land of milk and honey. Again, what is that exactly? It's different for each one of us. For me, it is the ability to be able to thank God for the love that I have received during my lifetime. It is seeing my 3 children living life knowing and acknowledging the power that God has in their life. And the teaching of their children to recognize God and how they do not have to live life in scarcity, but in the abundant extravagance that is found in God. Living in God's extravagance does not mean that life is necessarily easy or without the challenges that really are dark and heartbreaking, physically demanding, emotionally draining, and bringing us down to our knees crying out for mercy and justice and release. God never promised us easy street. But God has promised to be with us on our journey, as demonstrated throughout the whole of Scripture. Our story is one of triumph and of enduring love. And I'm going to close giving you our story through the writings as it's found in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you have not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. This is who we are. Each and every one of you are a chosen people, a people of abundance, a people of extravagant mercy and love. We are a people whose ancestors were a wandering Aramaean. This is the story that defines us. Let us share that story